Back in our starting project we worked on, let's improve this project. Thus far we only use two components. The app component, our main component, and container, which contains our state, and the person component, a functional component which simply outputs one single person. With these two components together, we get this output here. And there's nothing wrong with this output, it's definitely working fine, but of course, behind the scenes, we can still tweak this a little bit. For example, you would typically split this application in more components than that. The question always is, what should go into its own component, and what do you group together in a higher component, in the root component, for example. Now, if we analyze our existing components, we see that the person component is pretty focused. It displays the card of one person, the information of one person. It handles a click on that card. So this component doesn't need any more splitting up. What would you put into its own component? You could outsource the input into its own component. That might make sense if you want to create a generic input component across your application where you really only change the styling. But if that's not the goal, putting input into its own component doesn't make much sense. So for us, we can definitely leave it here. And the same for the paragraphs. If you want to create some custom paragraph wrapper component which gives all your paragraphs some specific styling and behavior, you might want to put it into its own component. If it's only about a global styling though, use the global style sheet, the index CSS file, and simply set up your styles there. So the person component really is finished. We probably don't need to do much more here. We can split up our app.js file though. We manage the state and we actually do a lot of things there. If we have a look at our render method, which in the end decides what this component is responsible for rendering for, we see that we render the list of persons here, but that we also, of course, do have this toggle button. Now, typically, container components like the app.js component, so components which also manage state, shouldn't be involved with the UI rendering too much. Put in other words, their render method should be rather lean and contain not too much JSX. So whilst it's not necessarily the worst practice to have this kind of app component, especially for a small app like this one is, we might still split this up into more components. For example, it might make sense to create a person list component, or a persons component is how we could name it. We could then simply pass this array of persons into this component, and inside that persons component, we would do the mapping and render the list. This would allow us to outsource all this code and in the end just import persons into our app component and either render it if show persons is true or not render it. So this is one improvement. Another improvement we can do, and this of course is purely optional, is to outsource our cockpit into its own component. So that in the end our app component really only has this wrapping div and then a cockpit component and a persons component. As always in life, this is optional. It is a good practice though, since it will make our app component more focused and gives us these other components which also have a clear focus instead of having everything mixed up in the app component. So let's create these new components. For that, in the source folder, I'll create a persons folder, and in there a persons.js component file. Now, in my opinion, it also makes sense to move the person folder into the persons folder to have this kind of nesting, because a person really is just, well, one single element which we're about to render a list of in the persons component anyways. This is purely optional, but having this kind of structure definitely makes sense. We can improve this even more. In our source folder, we might also add things like an assets folder, which contains images or stuff like that. So it might make sense to create a components folder in the source folder, which holds all our components, like the persons component, so that we can clearly see that components go in there. We also might have an assets folder, as I mentioned, which contains images we include, and so on. We also might have, in the source folder though, a containers folder, which holds all our containers, like the app.js and its respective CSS file. So we can move that into the containers folder. Also move the testing file there, even though we haven't worked with that yet. So now we restructured our application to only have the index.js file directly in the source folder, then have a list of the containers we know, and then have a list of the components we know. Of course, this will break the application for now because all our imports are wrong now. So the goal now is to fix these imports before we, in the next lectures, continue working on that persons component, and I already mentioned it, on that cockpit component. So cockpit.js. I guess this makes sense, so let's fix the imports before we then move on with the actual meat for the cockpit and persons component in the next lecture. Regarding the imports, in app.js, we need to reach out to the person component. For now, we're going to remove it soon though, by going up one level, because then we'll leave the containers folder and we're back in the source folder. And after going up one level, we want to go into the components folder and there into the persons folder and then person. This would be the new path how to reach the person.js file from our app.js file. The app CSS import path is still correct because it's still sitting next to app.js. In the index.js file, we also need to adjust the import pointing to app.js. There, it's no longer sitting in the same folder. Instead, we need to go into the containers folder, and there we will find the app.js file. So we need to adjust this import too. And this is it for now. Next, we need to create this persons.js and this cockpit.js file, or they were created, of course, but we need to fill them with live. And then we can really see an improved and focused component structure.